Boone County, Nebraska, 1873. While his neighbors raced to throw up frame houses before winter, John Turner was still digging in late September. An English immigrant with no frontier pride to protect, he carved his home straight into the east side of a hill. His neighbors called it living like an animal. They called him a disgrace to proper settlement. He built 3 walls of earth and 1 wall of logs, with a roof of poles, brush, hay, and dirt layered thick enough to walk on. He spent weeks on what they finished in days, a buried cabin with nothing showing but a stovepipe and a door. Then January 12th, 1888 arrived. The children's blizzard hit without warning. Temperatures plunged from 44 degrees at 2 in the afternoon to 42 below by morning, an 86-degree crash in less than 24 hours. Frame houses turned into ice boxes. Stoves gulped fuel and lost the fight against wind tearing through every seam. 235 people froze to death. But that buried cabin on the hillside, it stayed 50 degrees warmer than the failing structures in town. What did Turner understand about earth, wind, and heat that everyone else dismissed as primitive? And how did his underground fortress become the difference between comfort and death when the worst blizzard in Plains history put every shelter to the test? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. John Turner stepped off the Union Pacific in Grand Island, Nebraska, in April of 1873 with $47, a canvas bag of tools, and the kind of practical English stubbornness that viewed American frontier optimism with deep suspicion. He had worked stone and timber in Yorkshire's hill country, where wind meant business and winter killed the foe, unprepared. The Nebraska Territory's boosters promised him rich soil and mild seasons, but Turner had read the climate data from the Army Signal Service weather stations. He knew the Great Plains produced temperature swings that would snap a Yorkshire man's spine if he built like he was still in Leeds. By late May, Turner had filed his homestead claim on a quarter section in Boone County, 160 acres of rolling prairie with a creek running through the northeast corner and a modest hill rising from the southern boundary. The land agent who processed his paperwork made it clear that Turner was expected to build something that looked like progress. Frame houses were going up fast across the county, most of them simple rectangles with board and batten siding, single-wall construction, and stone or brick chimneys that announced civilized settlement from miles away. The faster you got walls up and a roof on, the sooner you could prove up your claim and start looking like a real American farmer instead of a dirt-poor immigrant camping on government land. Turner walked his property for 3 days, studying the hill's contours and watching how the wind moved across the open ground. The prevailing winds came from the northwest, driving straight across the flat prairie with nothing to slow them down. But the hill's eastern face offered natural protection, and the morning sun would warm that slope even in the depths of winter. He had seen similar terrain in the Yorkshire Dales, where old shepherds had built stone huts tucked into hillsides that stayed warm with nothing more than a small peat fire. The principle was simple: let the earth do the work instead of fighting it with thin walls and wishful thinking. When Turner started digging in early June, his nearest neighbor, a carpenter named William Hendricks, who had built 4 frame houses that spring, stopped by to see what the Englishman was attempting. Hendricks found Turner 20 feet into the hillside, excavating a rectangular chamber with hand tools and a wheelbarrow. The back wall was clean earth, carved vertical and smooth. The side walls angled slightly inward for stability. The floor sloped gently toward what would become the front entrance, creating natural drainage that would carry any moisture away from the living space instead of pooling in corners where it could freeze and crack the structure. Hendricks studied the excavation and shook his head. A man could build a proper house in the time Turner was spending on this hole in the ground. Frame lumber was available at the railroad depot in Columbus, 20 miles south, and a standard 16 by 20 cabin could be framed, sided, and roofed in 2 weeks if a man worked steadily and had help with the heavy lifting. Turner's dugout might be faster to start, but it would never look like anything more than a badger den with pretensions. Decent folks would assume he was too poor or too lazy to build above ground, and when it came time to sell the property or bring in a wife, No woman with any sense would want to live underground like some kind of prairie dog. Turner listened politely and kept digging. He had calculated the thermal dynamics of his situation with the same methodical precision he had once applied to Yorkshire stone walls. A standard frame house in this climate would have 4 walls exposed to wind and weather, with minimal insulation and gaps between boards that would leak heated air all winter long. When the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, a thin-walled structure would lose heat faster than any reasonable firebox could replace it. His dugout would have 3 walls of earth, material that stayed at a relatively constant temperature year-round and blocked wind infiltration completely. The only exposed wall would be the front face, built with logs chinked tight and positioned to catch morning sunlight, while staying protected from the worst of the prevailing winds. By July, word of Turner's project had spread through the county. Farmers stopping by the claim would find him cutting and fitting logs for the front wall or laying poles across the excavation to form the roof structure. The design was simple but deliberate, heavy timber beams spanning the width of the dugout, with smaller poles laid perpendicular to create a solid platform. Over the poles went a layer of brush and prairie grass, then a thick coating of clay-rich earth that would shed water and provide insulation. The finished roof would be strong enough to support a horse and rider, invisible from more than 100 yards away, and sealed tight enough to keep out wind and moisture. The local land agent, a Missouri transplant named James Morrison, who had sold homestead parcels to 63 families that year, made a point of visiting Turner's claim in late August. Morrison's job depended on attracting serious settlers who would build substantial improvements and prove that Boone County was ready for civilization. Dugouts were legal under the homestead laws, but they sent the wrong message to potential buyers and Eastern investors who expected to see evidence of permanent development. Morrison suggested that Turner might want to consider the dugout a temporary measure while he saved money for a real house that would add value to the neighborhood and reflect well on his character. Turner thanked Morrison for his concern and continued laying the roof. He mixed clay, grass, and water into a thick mortar that would dry hard and crack-resistant, then spread it 6 inches deep over the brush layer. The earth roof would absorb summer heat during the day and release it slowly at night, moderating temperature swings in both directions. In winter, snow would add another layer of insulation, and the thermal mass of the surrounding earth would buffer the interior against the kind of sudden temperature drops that could turn a frame house into a death trap when fuel ran low or wind found. Gaps in the construction. By September, Turner had moved into his buried cabin. The interior measured 12 by 16 feet, with a ceiling 7 feet high and walls that stayed dry even during heavy rains. A small window in the front wall provided light, and the door opened onto a recessed entrance that stayed protected from drifting snow. The whole structure had cost him $11 in materials and 6 weeks of steady work, faster and cheaper than any frame house, and engineered specifically for the realities of Plains weather instead of the expectations of Eastern building traditions. His neighbors called it living like an animal, but Turner was building for January. The first hard freeze came in mid-October, dropping temperatures into the teens overnight and coating the prairie grass with crystals that crunched underfoot until the sun burned them off by mid-morning. Turner woke in his dugout to find the air inside his buried cabin still comfortable enough to dress without. Hurrying, while his neighbor Hendricks was already splitting kindling at dawn to get his frame house warm enough for his family to leave their beds. The difference wasn't dramatic yet, but it was measurable, and Turner understood that the real test was still months away. Wind was the invisible enemy that most plains builders underestimated. A calm day at 20 degrees felt manageable, even pleasant if the sun was shining. But 20 degrees with a 30-mile-per-hour wind created conditions that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and drove cold air through every gap in a structure's envelope like water through a sieve. Frame houses, no matter how carefully built, had hundreds of potential leak points where boards joined, where windows met frames, where chimneys passed through roofs. Each gap was small, but collectively they created a ventilation system that worked against anyone trying to heat the interior space. Turner's dugout eliminated most of these problems by replacing 3 walls with solid earth. The hillside couldn't leak. It couldn't shift in the wind or develop gaps between boards. The earth around his living space stayed at approximately 55 degrees year-round, insulated by depth and mass from the temperature swings that tormented surface structures. When the outside air dropped towards zero, his buried walls were still holding steady at a temperature that felt warm to the touch. The only surface that could leak heat was the front wall, and Turner had built it with 8-inch logs chinked tight with clay mortar and backed by a layer of sod blocks that sealed any remaining gaps. The thermal mass principle was something Turner had learned from Yorkshire stone buildings, but it applied even more dramatically in plains earth construction. Thermal mass meant that materials with weight and density absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, creating a buffer against rapid temperature changes. A thin frame wall had almost no thermal mass. It heated, up fast and cooled down fast, following whatever the outside temperature demanded. But tons of earth surrounding Turner's living space had enormous thermal mass, storing heat during warm periods and releasing it gradually when conditions turned cold. The mathematics of heating a dugout versus heating a frame house were brutally simple. A standard cabin might have 4 walls, a floor, and a ceiling exposed to outside temperatures, 6 surfaces losing heat constantly. Turner's dugout had only 1 wall, part of a roof, and a small floor area that could lose heat to the outside. Even more important, the temperature difference his small heating stove had to overcome was far smaller. When outside air reached 20 below zero, Hendricks was trying to heat his cabin interior from 20 below to 70 above, a 90-degree lift. Turner's stove only had to lift the temperature from the earth-buffered 50 degrees to 70 degrees, a 20-degree lift that required less than a quarter of the fuel. Turner had positioned his dugout on the east face of the hill for reasons that became obvious once the sun's angle changed in late fall. Morning sunlight hit the front wall directly, adding passive solar heating when the structure needed it most. The recessed entryway stayed protected from northwest winds that could drive snow horizontally across the prairie and create drifts 12 feet deep in a single storm. The roof's earth covering meant that snow didn't slide off onto the ground in front of the door. It stayed put, adding another layer of insulation exactly where Turner needed it most. Drainage was the engineering challenge that separated successful dugouts from failures. Water was earth construction's mortal enemy, and the plains could deliver it in forms that destroyed poorly planned shelters. Spring snowmelt, summer thunderstorms, and winter freeze-thaw cycles all created moisture that had to be channeled away from living spaces, or it would create conditions that made underground dwellings uninhabitable. Turner had sloped his floor toward the entrance, cut drainage channels around the perimeter of the excavation, and positioned the structure high enough on the hillside that groundwater would flow past rather than through his walls. The roof design incorporated 4 distinct layers that worked together to shed water and retain heat. The bottom layer was heavy timber poles spanning the width of the dugout, strong enough to carry the weight of everything above them. Over the poles went a layer of brush and small branches that created air spaces and prevented the upper layers from sifting down into the living space. The third layer was prairie grass and hay, packed thick to provide insulation and create a base for the final covering. The top layer was 6 inches of clay-rich earth, mixed with grass to prevent cracking and sloped gently to carry rain and snowmelt away from the structure. By November, Turner's heating routine had settled into a pattern that used less than half the firewood Hendricks burned in his frame house. A small fire in the morning took the chill off the interior and started the thermal mass absorbing heat. The earth walls and roof held that warmth throughout the day, releasing it slowly as outside temperatures dropped. Evening fires were brief and efficient, adding just enough heat to maintain comfort without fighting massive heat losses through exposed surfaces. The dugout stayed consistently warmer than outside temperatures, but it also stayed cooler than the peak heat of summer days. The Earth's thermal mass worked in both directions, moderating temperature swings that made frame houses stifling in July and Arctic in January. Turner could work comfortably inside his buried cabin during weather that sent his neighbors huddling around their stoves or fleeing to whatever shade they could find. As December settled over Boone County, Turner's neighbors began to notice that his chimney produced a thin stream of smoke while theirs belched thick clouds from stoves working at maximum output. The Englishman's fuel pile stayed steady while theirs shrank daily. His buried cabin showed no signs of frost buildup on the windows, while their frame houses developed ice on interior walls within feet of roaring fires. The mockery was starting to sound less confident, but it would take a genuine crisis to change minds that had already decided dugouts were primitive shelters for people too poor or lazy to build properly above ground. Turner wasn't building for approval. He was building for January 12th, 1888, a date that would prove whether his buried cabin was engineering or just a hole in the ground with pretensions. The morning of January 12th, 1888, began with conditions so mild that children in Boone County walked to school without heavy coats. The Army Signal Service weather station in nearby Columbus recorded 44 degrees at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, warm enough for farmers to work outside in shirt sleeves and for housewives to hang laundry on lines that had been frozen solid for weeks. The sky held a peculiar quality that experienced plains dwellers recognized as dangerous, but the temperature felt like an early taste of spring after a winter that had already delivered more than its share of brutal cold snaps. Turner spent the warm afternoon splitting firewood behind his dugout, working steadily but without the urgency that had driven his neighbors to attack their fuel supplies during the previous month's cold spell. His buried cabin had used so little wood that his winter supply remained largely intact, stacked and seasoned under a canvas shelter that protected it from moisture while keeping it accessible during storms. The earth-sheltered design meant he could afford to be selective about when he burned fuel, heating only when comfort required it, rather than fighting constantly against heat loss through exposed surfaces. By 4 o'clock, the wind had shifted from south to northwest and picked up speed, carrying a metallic scent that made horses nervous and sent cattle clustering in whatever shelter they could find. The temperature began dropping fast enough to feel the change from minute to minute, and the quality of light took on the gray-white cast that preceded serious weather. Turner finished splitting his afternoon's quota of kindling and carried several armloads inside, stacking them near his small heating stove, where they would stay dry and ready regardless of what the night might bring. The blizzard announced itself with a sound that veteran plains settlers would remember for the rest of their lives, a low howling that rose from the northwest horizon like the approach of a massive freight train, accompanied by a wall of white that stretched across the entire visible sky. Within minutes, the temperature plunged from the 40s into the teens, and the wind speed climbed past 50 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the prairie with enough force to strip bark from trees and sandblast any exposed surfaces. In town, families who had enjoyed the afternoon warmth found themselves scrambling to close storm windows and fire up heating stoves that had been banked low during the mild spell. The sudden temperature drop caught most households with inadequate fuel supplies immediately available, and the wind-driven cold began finding every gap in their frame construction. Houses that had felt reasonably tight during calm weather became sieves as the blizzard tested every joint, every window frame, every place where different materials met and created potential leak points. William Hendricks, the carpenter who had built 4 houses that spring, discovered that his own cabin was losing heat faster than his stove could replace it. The wind found gaps between floorboards and drove cold air up through the living space, while other drafts came through the walls, wherever boards had shrunk or settled since construction. His family gathered around the heating stove, but the area more than 6 feet away from the firebox became noticeably cold within the first hour of the storm, and frost began forming on the interior walls where moisture and their breath condensed against surfaces that couldn't stay warm enough to prevent ice buildup. The storm's intensity exceeded anything the region had experienced in recent memory. Wind speeds reached 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that made navigation impossible beyond a few yards. The temperature continued dropping throughout the evening, reaching 30 below zero by midnight and bottoming out at 42 below just before dawn. The combination of extreme cold and high wind created a thermal environment that overwhelmed heating systems and exposed the fatal weaknesses in structures that had seemed adequate during normal winter weather. Turner's dugout weathered the storm with almost contemptuous ease. The wind that tortured frame houses above ground found no purchase on his earth-sheltered walls. Snow that piled 12 feet deep against exposed structures simply added another layer of insulation to his already protected roof. The thermal mass of the surrounding hillside continued absorbing and releasing heat in its slow, steady rhythm, unaffected by the chaos raging across the surface of the prairie. Inside the buried cabin, Turner maintained a small fire that consumed less wood in 12 hours than his neighbors burned in 2. The earth walls around him held steady at their buffered temperature, while the outside air plunged toward levels that could freeze human flesh in minutes. His single exposed wall faced away from the worst of the wind, and the recessed entryway created a protected zone where snow couldn't drift against the door or create the kind of buildup that trapped families inside inadequately designed structures. The blizzard's victims began appearing before the storm ended. Families in frame houses found their heating systems overwhelmed by the combination of extreme cold and constant air infiltration. Stoves that had seemed adequate during previous cold spells couldn't maintain livable temperatures when wind drove the outside chill through every crack and gap in their structures. Some households burned furniture when their fuel supplies ran out. Others discovered that their chimneys couldn't draw properly in the extreme wind, filling their cabins with smoke while failing to provide adequate heat. Schools that had dismissed children during the afternoon warmth became death traps when the temperature crashed before students could reach home. The Mira Valley Schoolhouse, a frame building typical of rural Nebraska construction, offered minimal protection from conditions that made travel impossible and survival questionable. Teachers and students huddled around inadequate heating stoves while the wind found every weakness in the building's envelope and exploited it ruthlessly. By dawn on January 13th, the storm had killed 235 people across the Plain States, most of them caught between inadequate shelters or trapped in structures that couldn't maintain life-supporting temperatures when tested by genuinely severe conditions. The children's blizzard became a regional watershed that separated theoretical knowledge about Plains weather from demonstrated survival capacity, and it exposed the difference between buildings that looked civilized and shelters that actually worked when civilization's assumptions failed. Turner emerged from his dugout into a transformed landscape where snow had drifted 20 feet deep in some areas while leaving other spots scoured clean by the wind. His buried cabin had consumed less fuel during the worst blizzard in regional memory than most of his neighbors used during an ordinary cold snap, and the interior had never dropped below a temperature that allowed comfortable sleep without heavy blankets. The storm had ended, but the testing had just begun. The aftermath of the children's blizzard revealed the brutal arithmetic of shelter performance under extreme conditions. When Turner ventured out on the morning of January 13th to check on his neighbors, he found a landscape that demonstrated the difference between theoretical cold weather construction and actual survival engineering. Houses that had looked substantial and properly built. 3 days earlier now showed signs of thermal failure that would have been invisible during normal winter weather, but became glaringly obvious when tested by 42 degrees below zero and 60-mile-per-hour winds. At the Hendricks place, Turner found a family that had survived the night by burning furniture, books, and anything else combustible they could find inside their frame house. Despite consuming nearly a full cord of firewood plus emergency fuel, the interior temperature had never risen above freezing more than 6 feet from the stove. Ice had formed on the interior walls where the family's breath condensed against surfaces too cold to prevent frost buildup. The single-wall construction that seemed adequate during mild weather had become a thermal sieve when wind pressure drove outside air through every gap between boards, around window frames, and through the countless small openings that frontier carpentry left unsealed. Turner's dugout had maintained an interior temperature of 68 degrees throughout the storm, while consuming less than an eighth of the fuel that Hendricks burned. The 50-degree difference between the two structures wasn't a matter of superior heating equipment or more generous fuel supplies. It was pure engineering. The buried cabin's 3 earth walls couldn't leak heat because they were surrounded by thermal mass that stayed at a consistent 55 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. The single exposed wall faced away from the prevailing wind and was protected by the recessed entryway that prevented snow from drifting against the door or creating the kind of buildup that could trap occupants inside. The temperature differential became even more dramatic when Turner visited families whose heating systems had failed entirely during the storm. The Morrison household, built by the same carpenter who had criticized Turner's dugout as primitive, had suffered complete thermal collapse when their stove couldn't draw properly in the extreme wind conditions. The family had survived by retreating to a single room and sharing body heat under every blanket they owned, but the interior temperature had dropped to near zero, a 70-degree difference from the comfortable warmth inside Turner's earth-sheltered cabin. The technical explanation for these performance differences lay in basic heat transfer principles that most frontier builders either didn't understand or chose to ignore in favor of speed and appearance. Heat moved through building materials in three ways: conduction through solid surfaces, convection through air movement, and radiation across empty spaces. Frame houses failed because they allowed all three forms of heat loss to operate simultaneously and catastrophically. Thin walls conducted heat rapidly to the outside. Air leaks created convection currents that carried warm air out and cold air in. Large interior spaces allowed radiant heat to dissipate before it could warm the areas where families needed comfort. Turner's dugout controlled all three heat loss mechanisms through deliberate design choices that his neighbors had dismissed as crude or unnecessary. The earth walls eliminated conductive heat loss through 3/4 of the structure's envelope because the surrounding soil stayed at a stable temperature year-round. The tight construction and protected entrance prevented convective heat loss by eliminating the air leaks that turned other buildings into wind. Tunnels during storms. The compact interior space retained radiant heat efficiently, with the thermal mass of the earth walls absorbing warmth during heating periods and releasing it slowly when the fire burned low. The fuel consumption comparison provided the clearest measure of each shelter's thermal efficiency. Hendricks had burned through 4 days' worth of normal winter fuel during the single night of the blizzard, plus furniture and other emergency combustibles, while achieving interior temperatures that barely supported survival. Turner had used less wood than he normally consumed during a mild winter evening while maintaining comfortable living conditions throughout the crisis. The mathematics were stark. His buried cabin required roughly 1/10 the energy input to achieve far superior thermal performance. The storm had also revealed critical differences in structural resilience that became apparent only under extreme wind loading. Frame houses throughout the county showed signs of stress where constant pressure from 60-mile-per-hour gusts had found weak points in their construction. Roof panels had lifted, siding had loosened, and foundation settling had opened gaps that would plague these structures for years to come. The dugout's earth-covered roof had actually grown stronger under the storm's assault, as the weight of accumulated snow compressed the soil layers into an even more effective thermal barrier. Water management, the engineering challenge Turner had addressed through careful drainage design, proved crucial during the blizzard's aftermath. Melting snow and ice created runoff that infiltrated poorly sited structures, while his hillside placement and sloped excavation channeled moisture safely away from the living space. Several frame houses in lower-lying areas suffered flood damage when snowmelt found its way through compromised foundations, creating interior moisture problems that would persist long after the temperature returned to normal levels. The storm had created a controlled experiment in shelter design, with identical weather conditions testing every structure in the county simultaneously. The results were measurable and undeniable. Earth-sheltered construction outperformed conventional frame building by margins so wide that they couldn't be attributed to luck, superior materials, or better craftsmanship. The dugout had simply been engineered for the conditions it would face, while the frame houses had been built for the conditions their owners hoped they would face. Word of Turner's thermal success spread through the county faster than news of the storm's casualties. Families who had barely survived the blizzard in their conventional houses began asking detailed questions about dugout construction techniques, site selection, and thermal performance. The mockery that had greeted Turner's buried cabin 15 years earlier gave way to respectful curiosity about engineering principles that had proven themselves under the most extreme tests the plains could deliver. The carpenter Hendricks, whose own house had nearly killed his family during the storm, appeared at Turner's door 3 days after the blizzard ended. He carried a notebook and a measuring tape, ready to learn construction techniques he had dismissed as primitive when they challenged his assumptions about proper frontier building. The conversation that followed would change how structures were built throughout Boone County for the next generation, but it began with a simple admission. Turner had been right about the relationship between earth, wind, and human survival on the Great Plains. The transformation of Boone County's building practices began quietly in the weeks following the children's blizzard, as families whose frame houses had nearly killed them during the storm started asking Turner practical questions about earth-sheltered construction. The conversations weren't dramatic or ceremonial, just neighbors, stopping by to examine his dugout's design details and inquire about site selection, drainage techniques, and thermal performance under extreme conditions. Turner answered their questions with the same methodical precision he had applied to the original construction, explaining principles rather than promoting a particular building style. William Hendricks arrived with his notebook on a gray February morning, ready to document construction techniques he had dismissed 15 years earlier as beneath the dignity of proper settlement. Turner walked him through the excavation process, explaining why the east-facing orientation captured morning sunlight while protecting the entrance from prevailing winds. He demonstrated the drainage slope that channeled moisture away from the living space and showed how the layered roof construction shed water while providing thermal insulation. Hendricks took careful notes on timber sizing, excavation dimensions, and the clay mortar recipe that sealed gaps between logs in the exposed front wall. The dugout's thermal performance data became the foundation for a new approach to plains construction that borrowed earth-sheltering principles without requiring families to live entirely underground. Hendricks designed hybrid structures that used earth berming around conventional frame walls, reducing the exposed surface area that could lose heat during extreme weather. Other builders experimented with earth-covered roofs that provided superior insulation compared to standard shingle construction, while still maintaining the appearance of conventional houses that satisfied social expectations about proper frontier dwellings. Turner's influence spread through practical demonstration rather than evangelism. He welcomed visitors who wanted to examine his construction techniques, but never promoted dugout living as superior to other building methods. The buried cabin had solved his specific problems, scarce timber, limited funds, and the need for reliable thermal performance during severe weather, but he understood that other settlers faced different constraints and priorities. His contribution was technical knowledge that could be adapted to various construction approaches rather than a universal housing solution. The Nebraska State Historical Society would eventually document Turner's story as part of their frontier housing collection, noting that his dugout represented a successful adaptation of traditional earth-sheltering techniques to Great Plains conditions. The memoir he wrote in his 70s described the children's blizzard as a regional teacher that exposed the difference between building for appearance and building for performance. His account emphasized practical lessons rather than personal vindication, focusing on construction techniques that had proven reliable under extreme stress. By 1890, earth-bermed construction had become common throughout Boone County, with more than 40 structures, incorporating some form of earth protection for thermal efficiency. The hybrid approach satisfied both practical and social requirements, providing improved cold weather performance while maintaining the visual characteristics that marked a settlement as civilized and permanent. These buildings survived subsequent severe weather events with fuel consumption and interior temperature performance that approached Turner's original dugout specifications. The broader engineering principles that Turner had demonstrated found applications beyond residential construction. County schools adopted earth berming and improved insulation standards after the Mira Valley schoolhouse tragedy highlighted the lethal consequences of inadequate thermal design. Commercial buildings in Columbus and other regional centers began incorporating earth protection and thermal mass elements that reduced heating costs while providing more stable interior conditions during extreme weather events. Turner's dugout became a reference point for a generation of plains builders who understood that successful frontier construction required adaptation to local climate conditions rather than blind adherence to Eastern building traditions. The earth-sheltered design principles he had proven during the 1888 blizzard influenced construction techniques throughout the region for decades, creating a distinctive Great Plains architectural tradition that prioritized thermal performance over conventional appearance standards. The legacy extended beyond building techniques to encompass a broader understanding of environmental adaptation that shaped how plains communities approached infrastructure development. Turner's success with earth sheltering encouraged similar experiments with wind protection, water management, and resource conservation that helped transform the Great Plains from a region where survival was questionable into an area where sustainable settlement became possible for families with modest resources and practical building skills. Modern earth-sheltered construction continues to validate the principles Turner applied to his Boone County dugout, with contemporary builders using advanced materials and techniques to achieve the same fundamental goals of thermal efficiency and weather resistance. Current energy-efficient building standards recognize earth contact and thermal mass as critical design elements for cold climate construction, vindicating approaches that frontier builders developed through necessity and refined through experience with extreme weather events. Turner lived in his dugout for 37 years, eventually adding a frame addition for guests and storage while maintaining the original earth-sheltered core as his primary living space. Visitors to his homestead in the early 1900s found a comfortable, well-appointed dwelling that demonstrated how earth-sheltered construction could provide both practical performance and dignified living conditions. His fuel consumption remained remarkably low throughout his residence there, and the structure showed no signs of deterioration despite decades of exposure to plains weather extremes. The Children's Blizzard of 1888 became a benchmark event that separated theoretical knowledge about cold weather construction from demonstrated survival capacity under genuinely extreme conditions. Turner's dugout had not merely survived the test, it had performed so effectively that it established new standards for thermal efficiency and weather resistance that influenced plains construction practices for generations. The buried cabin that neighbors had mocked as primitive proved to be advanced engineering that understood the relationship between earth, wind, and human survival better than conventional building wisdom of its era. When Turner died in 1923, his obituary in the Columbus newspaper noted his role in developing earth-sheltered construction techniques that had saved lives and resources throughout the region. The dugout remained structurally sound and thermally efficient, a testament to engineering principles that had been proven correct by the harshest conditions the Great Plains could deliver.